Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast, and we are here with you podcasting from different locations in Connecticut, but we want you to know that we actually have hope of being back in a real pub in the very near future, and we're eager to do that. One of the things that we're trying to determine is how and whether or not, or maybe I should put it, whether or not we should do it, and how, if we decide to do it, we do it. How do we keep the video feature and we're able to record and post to our Facebook page and then to YouTube and all that kind of stuff. But we'll keep you posted on that. But anyway, we are excited about that. We're going to be getting some new microphones soon because our Indiegogo campaign was successful and we've got some money. So we're glad. And we thank all the folks that contributed to that. But anyway, as you know, this is the Theology Pugcast. I'm C.R. Wiley, the senior pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Manchester in Manchester, Connecticut, and I've written stuff. And Tom, tell us about you.
Tom Price, a systematic theologian, Christian ethicist, teaching both at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
And Glenn, go ahead. I'm sorry, Glenn, and go ahead and feel free to give us the segue into the show because it's your day.
Sure. I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a professor of early modern European history at Central Connecticut State University, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and I've got my own little ministry called Every Square Inch Ministries. And the reason why I mentioned this time that I'm a professor of early modern Europe is because, well, the way Europeanists do this, the early modern period begins with the Reformation and it ends with the French Revolution. And what I want to take a look at really today is the events leading up to the French Revolution. We'll see how far we get. We may get into a few other things, because I think a lot of what happened in the French Revolution has got some important implications for us today. Okay, so that's where we're going here. So it's going to be a bit of a history lesson. So let's start off with 18th century France. France in this period was really just sort of a huge mass of contradictions. It was the wealthiest country in Europe, but it had an impoverished peasantry. It was the center of the Enlightenment, but it had an ignorant peasantry. It was the most centralized state in Europe, but it was shot through with all kinds of local privileges and rights and things like that that undermined the central government. All kinds of things going on, really complicated mess. If you want a good summary of it, read the first sentence of A Tale of Two Cities. That'll do it for you. Now, all right, so that's the conditions in the country. One of the things that was going on that I think was will be particularly important as we're heading into the revolution is the growth of the Enlightenment. Now, when we talk about the Enlightenment, we usually think of this in really positive terms. I mean, the very word itself, enlightenment, what's the alternative? The endarkment or something? It implies that the world was, dark and ignorant and all of that. And then the Enlightenment comes along and the lights go on and everybody starts thinking again and so on. This is sort of the stereotype of it. But let's take a look at what the Enlightenment in France particularly really was, because the Enlightenment varies depending on what country you're in. In France, what you see emerging is the Enlightenment is led by a group of people who are called the philosophes. Now, the word philosophe, if you look it up in a dictionary, French-English dictionary, it will say a philosopher. These guys weren't philosophers, okay? Not in our sense of the word. What they were basically social critics. Okay? Now, a lot of these guys were really bright. They were polymaths. You get people who are writing treatises in mathematics and philosophy and doing poetry and literary criticism and so on, all wrapped up in the same person. These guys were really bright. But the main thing that they were, in a lot of ways, were social critics. They didn't like the way the country was being run. They didn't like the way the society was. And what they really wanted to do was find ways of improving it using reason. They had their theories, the ways that they thought the world should be, and they believed that they ought to really get a chance to implement their ideas to prove that they were right and that everything would be better if you did it their way. Now, the fact of the matter is, France in this period did have a lot of problems. There was a lot of social reform that was needed, and these guys thought they were just the people to put it in place. And what you do then is you get this group of intellectuals who then sort of team up with the progressive aristocracy and the wealthy bourgeoisie, the wealthy middle class people, the business owners, people like that. They meet together in these rooms called salons, where they'd rub shoulders, and this would give the philosophes a chance to spread their ideas to the classes that were really the movers and shakers in society.
Let's stop there, Glenn, and just think about that for a moment, because I don't think that most people sort of in our churches, sort of in the sort of mainstream of our society, think about it in those terms. They don't think about the way it happened then, but they also don't sort of understand the way it's always been that way. In other words, idea people generally are not great implementers. And there's this kind of paradoxical kind of relationship that they have with these people who are good implementers, people who are wealthy, but people who are wealthy maybe, but also have aspirations to make some kind of contribution to the public good or whatever. And so there's a kind of meeting.
Yeah, or intellectual pretensions.
Well, yeah, I was putting it in the best light.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is the way that in France, this is how it happened. These ideas of this sort of intellectual elite, progressive, liberal, all of these kinds of things spread to the propertied classes, the aristocracy, the business owners, merchants, all of these kinds of things. And these are the people who have at least the potential to implement the ideas. Now, the thing about this is, one of the, I would argue, fatal flaws in this whole thing is that these salons are not study rooms. They're places where people meet for entertainment, to talk, to schmooze, to do all of those kinds of things. And so in order to be invited back, you had to be an entertaining conversationalist. You had to be witty.
Right.
And here's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
When you're a social critic,
Mm-hmm.
it is much easier to be witty in identifying problems than in proposing solutions.
Yeah.
So the net result is these rooms were places that were just full of satirical, sarcastic, snide critiques of the society.
Mm-hmm.
Only the vaguest idea of what we're going to do, how we're going to implement change.
You mean the French? The French of all people?
Yeah, hard to believe, but that was the way they were in the 18th century. So,
this reminds me of my favorite, one of my favorite moralists, La Rochefoucauld. His maxims, his sayings. He's the one who coined the phrase. Hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue, and it would, of course, made the room just roll with laughter. And that was what it was all about. For him, it was sort of, he was stand-up comedy for the salons.
Right. And if you want a really good example, look at Voltaire.
Oh, yeah.
Voltaire was sort of the uber philosophe in a lot of ways.
Right.
And if you read a work like Candide satirizes pretty much anything that moves and several things that don't.
Right.
I mean,
right.
He goes after the French, he goes after the Germans, he goes after the English, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Italians, the Turks. He goes after Catholics, Lutherans, Protestants. The only one he doesn't go after are the Anabaptists, because that's shooting fish in a barrel. Everybody picks on it. Yeah, I mean,
right,
just sort of on and on and on. Anything that did anything, Voltaire satirized. He made fun of, he mocked.
Right.
And the thing that is really significant is Voltaire spent 25 years away from Paris. Part of that was because he was exiled for part of it. He had his penchant for getting himself into trouble by insulting the wrong people. But when his final play was written, it was going to open in Paris, and he took a 5-day journey there to see the opening of this play. And when he got there, he was treated like a major cultural hero, a major cultural icon.
Mm.
He is, it's almost like a Roman triumph. The triumphant general returning to the capital.
Hmm.
And he died shortly thereafter. 1778, if I remember right. This is 11 years before the Revolution. But I would argue that Voltaire's welcome in Paris meant that the revolution was inevitable.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly what form it would take was still up in the air. But at that point, the revolution was inevitable because once you internalize the kind of radical critique of society that Voltaire offered, once that got internalized to the degree that he is considered the major cultural hero, then that society can't stand.
Right.
You've lost, once you lose Paris, you lose France. And basically the old regime, the old order, the ancien regime that had really governed French life for centuries was so thoroughly discredited, as evidenced by the treatment of Voltaire, that its collapse was inevitable.
Right, right.
Now, you also had at this time Rousseau's significant influence, correct?
Right. Yeah.
And he is another seed kind of first fruits of the Romantics that have this kind of notion of the civilizing and the limits that any kind of civilization starts in any kind of structure starts to impose is already something that one needs to be liberated from. And then there's also this notion of the general will. So there's a whole pool of ideas floating around readying the place for that kind of move.
Yeah, I find it curious that people think a lot of people think Rousseau's kind of neat and interesting and all of that, the sort of back to nature theme and all of that. They sort of ignore the fact that during the Terror, Robespierre was a disciple of Rousseau. And he was essentially trying to implement Rousseau's ideas, and in the process killed a couple of 100,000 Frenchmen.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, and at a personal level, and just in terms of his personal conduct, Rousseau was not a nice person.
No.
He was a paranoid. He was a sexually irresponsible, libertine, fathering children and siring children, then handing them over to basically a woman who is incapable of caring for them and expecting the state to fill in the gap. Kind of like a lot of fathers today.
Put them in orphanages. He actually wrote a couple of books on educating children.
That's right. That's right.
They're extremely important today in schools of education.
Oh, yeah.
Voltaire himself commented, why would you take advice on child rearing from a guy who fathers a bunch of kids and then abandons all of them?
Right, right. Well, yeah, this kind of gets to something that I think many of us feel when we think about not only this particular episode, the French Revolution, but when we think about the intelligentsia, just generally speaking. What we have are people who give advice without skin in the game. These are people for whom, their directives are to be implemented upon other people. And anyway, that's just a whole other thing. But one of the things about
actually, Chris, no, it isn't. That's one of the reasons why I picked this topic. So
go for it. Go for it then.
Well, all right. I hope you will notice that one of the things that I mentioned was that the Enlightenment people had these radical critiques of society and they wanted to implement their theory. I use that word intentionally.
Right, right.
Because what we are seeing right now is effectively, in America, the same kind of thing. You have an intelligentsia that has their theory about the way things ought to be, that is based on a complete rejection of the past, based on a complete rejection and discrediting of everything that has occurred or existed in society, that is set up in alliance with business and the power brokers and the economic powers in the society to implement this. We're seeing a repeat of the pattern that we saw in 18th century France. Right. And I would argue that if, in fact, the kind of radical critique of American culture and society that you see taking place among people who are exponents of critical theory, that is now being embraced certainly by the schools, by universities, and increasingly by business and government entities, especially big business, if that gets embraced, the revolution's inevitable here, just like it was when Voltaire was embraced.
Right. And one of the things
What
about
form
that,
it takes, we don't know yet.
right. Well, one of the things, of course, when we talk about theory is often, within the scientific frame, you take your theory, you create an experiment, you see how it goes. And then and it's usually on a small scale in a laboratory, so it doesn't like spread. If it's it got viral, is it potentially viral? But I've noticed that we don't try that. Basically, it's like we're all in on the experiment or nothing.
Except we already did in Seattle.
Well, and that actually brings out something I wanted to get at. We in the United States, we've had innumerable attempts to create sort of small scale utopian communities, and they've all, failed. Here in New England and upstate New York, and we've got all the debris of failed, cultish or whatever, the Shakers or the Transcendentalists up in Massachusetts. Just example after example of failure.
Yeah, and people should remember that utopia means nowhere.
Right.
It doesn't exist.
It's interesting because the utopia is similar to this, the episode we did a couple of weeks ago on presentism. This present nowhere, right? Nowhere in terms of time, nowhere in terms of space. This nihil, if you want. It is something of a nihil, maybe a type of nihil, a void that somehow is able to generate absolute commitment grounded in nothing. It has no telos other than kind of superficial and vague kind of ideals, and even these are not, like you said, the closer they get to reality, there's something that they almost push away. They don't want reality to come up against the ideal, and therefore there is this kind of distancing from it. So I always, I can use the term Gnostic if I want, kind of in a certain way to describe it. I mean, it can be described other ways, but there is this sense in which somebody in their kind of pure radical autonomy that kind of just is a self-assertion out of this nothingness is asserting something onto reality that really is governed by nothing other than kind of psychological mechanisms of conditioning and triggering. That's what's kind of, you could not probably sit a lot of people down back at the French Revolution or now and actually probably get a coherent anything out of them in terms of what they're up to and what they want to see, other than just these kind of, kind of generalized points and psychological symbolic terms.
Because it's much easier to be witty when you're doing a critique than when you're actually proposing a solution.
Right. Yeah. Anyone who's ever built anything knows that building is a lot harder than tearing things down. That's one of the reasons why I think it would be really helpful for everyone to actually get out and work with their hands, because what you discover in the process is that your will isn't the only factor. There's a kind of feedback that goes on with the materials, the people, all this kind of stuff, and you try to do the best you can. I've heard politics described as the art of the possible. Mm-hmm. And so you're working with human beings, you're working with the conditions on the ground, and you're trying to make the best of it.
Well, and I think this is one of the problems of what, maybe you have to shift from Kantian man to psychological humanity, right? A psychological man, if you will. But here you have something very similar. Think about the way in which so much education now is addressing these. Basically, almost in a Rousseau sense, protecting them from having to bump up against the consequences of social life, real social life. And so there's always a buffer. There's always, the only things that get kind of reprimanded are the ones that are not socially fashionable in terms of political correctness. Right. But, what you see running rampant around the kind of anarchy going on is, clearly children who didn't have those boundaries. And there was a breaking down. It was an intentional breaking. Schools have been intentional doing this. The left in particular. This is part of their catechesis, if you will.
Right.
And so this creates this kind of anthropology, this notion of the human being that is completely manipulatable by these particular symbols and these particular triggers. And they have substance beside. They can't even build an argument. And if you have to build an argument, so they've been protected from ever having to bump up against the real world, whether it's with their hands in the dirt or even just genuine social discourse.
Yeah, but they're also the people who draw the hardest boundaries.
Okay.
They've never had boundaries themselves, and once they get to a position where they can assert themselves, the first thing they do is they set up hard boundaries around whatever it is that they believe, which can shift.
Yeah.
But whatever it is currently, those are absolute boundaries that must not be transgressed under any circumstance, or we will crush you.
Yeah.
Because utopias are always totalitarian.
And that boundary is a buffer to prevent reality from impacting them, because it does force the ideas to have to manifest themselves of how detached they are from being able to be realizable in human living.
And if in fact the ideas don't work, it must be because of a class enemy. So we go after the kulaks or whoever it is in the Soviet Union who are preventing the utopia from arriving. Or we go after we do the Cultural Revolution in China or whatever. Anybody who stands against the program is an enemy, and anything that goes wrong is done by government infiltration and sabotage. And we've got to root these people out and get rid of them, because any dissension threatens the coming of utopia.
Right. Yeah, it's like I think it was a film recently. It was called "There's No Murder in Paradise" or something along these lines. And it was about the fact that there was a serial killer in the Soviet Union, and yet there was no affirmation of it, because you can't use those terms and you can't look for things that actually you become a threat if you utilize terms like that, because you break the image that they're trying to present from their ideals. So yeah, it's a very fragile thing, and it has to protect itself with very rigorous force and aggression.
Well, one of the things, you mentioned the kulaks. Like when we think about the kulaks, we're not talking about like the owners of Amazon or Google here. These were people who were virtually peasants themselves, but they were
land.
Yeah, but they owned the land. I mean, they were basically people who were self-sufficient, virtuous, hardworking. When we hear the term petit bourgeois, we're talking about smallholders. These are people who own a shop, maybe a small farm, and they're the target of the radicals, and the radicals are in collusion with significant power brokers in society. And this is something I think that has puzzled many onlookers, particularly those who come from sort of a lower middle class background. They're like, why is it that these, Google people and these Amazon people and all these other people are lining up with all this radical stuff? And why am I the bad guy? I mean, what have I done? I mean, I own a hardware store. I built my own house. I've done these things. I've taken care of myself. I've been responsible, and I'm the guy that is the target.
Whose shop gets burned down in the riot.
That's it. In fact, I remember the Rodney King riots. I was in LA right before them. You could feel it in the air. And then when the riots broke out, I remember this black business owner. It was heart-wrenching to see him. His business in the neighborhood had been burnt down by the rioters, black Americans, and he was standing outside saying, "Why? Why did you burn my business down? I grew up in this neighborhood. I know you people. You know me. What was this all about?" And everybody's heads were, hung low. Everybody was ashamed. He was weeping. But that's what you get in these revolutions.
Yeah, it's worth noting that although the reputation, when the terror happens, and we'll get to the terror in a minute, when the terror happened, the majority of people executed were not, contrary to popular belief, the aristocracy or the wealthy. Most of them were urban workers, the proletariat types, peasants, things like that.
Which gets me back to the kulaks. Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen the documentary by Werner Herzog, Happy People?
No,
Happy People, it's a marvelous, it's about the kulaks, about some kulaks, a community of kulaks who had gone out to Siberia.
Yeah.
You know, because of the revolution, they fled so that they could secure their freedom in some of the most difficult terrain in the world. Yeah. They're in Siberia, of all places. At least there we'll be left alone. And they carve out this existence in the wilderness. And the name of the documentary is Happy People. Mm-hmm. They were genuinely happy.
Yeah.
And they were left alone because the commies didn't want anything to do with them out there.
Mm-hmm. It also, there's another kind of telling about, you know, even the capacity of enduring that kind of stuff. I don't think most people have any clue of what people endured in the kulaks. And I have relatives on my Finnish side who actually were contacted by relatives they had that were actually born in the kulaks. They were fought during the war. One of the oldest were captured, end up being sent to the kulaks and Siberia, end up having children there. Those children were born in the kulaks. They knew Russian, they knew German, and they knew Finnish. That's it. And when they left, they knew they had family in the US. They contacted my relatives and met in Germany. But the interesting thing is the sense of spirit that was not able to be broken in such heinous situations. The first thing my 90-year-old relative did when he was actually liberated from the kulaks is went back to Finland and wanted to get in his sauna.
So anyway, I think, though, that maybe some of our listeners may want to have a clarification here. So what you're referring to is the gulags, in other words, the Gulag Archipelago.
Yes, I'm talking about the encampments.
The prison camps. And the kulaks were a people.
Okay, I'm hearing you through the filter.
Right,
so,
right.
Yeah.
And the kulaks were a people that had been persecuted, who were originally, you know, in Russia and the Ukraine and went out. Anyway.
The best way to think of a kulak, it's like an English yeoman.
Right.
They're people, they're farmers who own their own land. They're not serfs. They're not tenant farmers or anything like that. They own their own land. And since they owned something, they were class enemies to the communists.
Right.
Yeah. And property, you see that connection as well. Is the tie is in some, whether it's Rousseau and his circumstance, property is very much tied to the civilizing, which is tied to the evil. Then also, you see that very much now. If you're a property owner or defending your property, you're seen as the system and complicit in the system. So you're evil no matter how you look at it.
Right. Whereas in the American experience and also in the classical Republican experience, property is where your virtue was cultivated.
Right.
You know, it's because you own property.
That's why there were property qualifications for voting. The idea was that if you had property, number one, you had skin in the game.
Right.
And, so you were less likely to take crazy risks. And number two, if you could manage your property well, it demonstrated a certain degree of wisdom and virtue. And
that's, you know, when we think about the early church, the Apostle Paul regarding, you know, elders in the church, if you can't manage your own household, how do you expect to manage the household of God? So, you know, the idea is that if your kids don't respect you, why would you expect anyone in the church to respect you? Right.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to jump ahead to another element of the French Revolution here. I mean, there are all kinds of things that we can talk about. The French Revolution has been discussed incessantly since it happened. But the thing that ultimately ends up triggering it is a fiscal crisis.
Oh.
The French government was in such severe debt that it was in danger of going bankrupt. And under those circumstances, that's what forced the calling of the Estates General, which leads ultimately to the storming of the Bastille and the setup of the National Convention and so on. So it's the fiscal crisis, the fact that the government was in hock past its earlobes and couldn't pay its bills, that was the precipitating factor for the revolution. Did you know that if you were to try to pay back the US national debt at the rate of $1 a second, it would take over 700,000 years?
Right.
Just a quick side note. I mean, and that was several months ago. It's probably considerably more than that now.
Right. Yeah, and we're in a world where people are holding our paper, and if all those people were to call it, if there was a situation in the United States that called into question the solvency of the currency, all those notes get called.
Yeah.
And you what follows is Great Depression and probably a world war.
It's a collapse of the entire global economic system, and that is always accompanied by major war.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's just note that when the fiscal crisis hits, ultimately what ends up happening is all of these Enlightenment theory guys take over via the National Convention, goes by a couple of different names. And what they discover very quickly is their theories can't solve the problem. The fiscal crisis continues. They attempt to solve it by doing something like confiscating church property.
That's where they always go, isn't it?
Yep. They attempt to solve it by confiscating church property. Then they begin issuing paper money, which initially starts off as being like government bonds and then turns into mandatory currency. And then when that didn't cover it, they began inflating the money supply, quantitative easing. Okay. And when that didn't work, it degenerated into ultimately the urban working classes allying themselves with the most radical party in the revolution, the Jacobins. They take over, and that's when Rousseau gets implemented and you see the terror.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, the problem, of course, is that I don't think, I've had very little evidence that many of the most radical people in this current situation we find ourselves in have any understanding of how economics generally has worked in the past.
Right.
There's a kind of a magical thinking that seems to hold the minds of many people.
Right. Yeah. The assumption that business can pay whatever it is that you demand for wages without raising prices or anything else, as if businesses were made of money.
Right.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean,
go ahead, Tom.
Universities and stuff. I mean, I hate to be, blanket honest, but I think a lot of the people currently enacting the kinds of things they're doing are, just completely have no clue about basic things, basic reasoning, basic inference, basic mathematics, basic economics, basic history. This is what I mean by psychological. I mean, they've been geared to be socialized in a particular way and see anything that's a threat to that. And so you can't really sit down and have a conversation about economics and they'll be like, okay, that's a better viewpoint. I mean, this is literally something very, easily manipulatable by power forces and these psychological triggers. I mean, look, you just have to display a video without any context and it can set roaring. I know some of it's manufactured, but on the other side, some of it's not. And, that kind of fervor, it's kind of what, I always say sometimes maybe the analogy is what we know of the kind of witch hunts in early New England at a certain point, the kind of, once it becomes a point of hysteria. But one of the things that I'm curious about, and I've always been tracing, the kind of things that lead to those kind of conditions. I know Eliot used to write on propaganda and the way in which those things were working, and technology is really very guilty in a lot of this. And this is something they didn't have, of course, in the French Revolution. But you can see, let's take the French Revolution and then just put it into a situation in which you have technology capable of manipulating the way that it does. I mean, you're dealing with a very severe set of circumstances on that end. But here's my question. What you see in the French Revolution, you could understand certain kinds of ethical drives because certain philosophical assumptions or theological assumptions were considered absolute assumptions. But what you have now is almost it's what one writer, I can't remember his name at this moment, called the retreat to commitment. What you have is sort of a commitment when people know that it's only a relative and arbitrary vision, but they turn it into an absolute vision. It becomes my identity or I'm threatened. And so you have something going on now that I think has the capacity to be far worse than anything we've ever known in terms of revolution, because of the kind of pliable yet absolutist psychology of people that are really ready to uproot what we would consider almost the most advanced time in human history in terms of opportunity and wealth and anything else, to turn it into the most oppressed and enchained situation.
And we have the fattest poor people in the history of the world.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. People, I ask my classes, I've stopped doing this, but I used to ask my classes, is there poverty in America? And the answer is, oh yeah, we've got a lot of poverty in America. And then I point out to them that in some parts of the world, what poverty means is people are dying of starvation in the streets. Oh, well, we don't have poverty like that, but we still have poverty because, it's all relative.
Yeah.
From a global perspective, we have got, there is a certain amount of it, but it's vanishingly small.
Well, this raises a couple of interesting questions that or at least it raises the questions in my mind that I've been pondering for a while. One has to do with relative privation, which is what we're talking about here. In an absolute sense, that's what I was getting at. We have, in terms of material well-being, the best situation in the history of the world. And there's no arguing with that. If you try to argue with that, it just demonstrates just how much your mind has been shaped by anti-Western ideologies. But the other thing has to do with just kind of the progress of civilization. There are people, and I think we've talked a little bit about this in the past, who talk about sort of the cycles of civilization, sort of the process by which a civilization grows, matures, enters into sort of senescence, decay. Jacques Berzon, he wrote a book here, or published a book here a few years ago called Dawn to Decadence. And whenever I've thought about the word decadence, before I read his book, I always thought, decadence is a time in which everybody's sort of given themselves over to physical pleasures, sensuality, that kind of thing. But when I read Berzon, he said, no, he corrected me, in effect, he said, decadence is essentially when a civilization has lost its reason for being, its purpose. It doesn't really have a future anymore.
Yeah, that resonates.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but and it's interesting, because I notice, kind of I'll listen to kind of different feeds here and there, interpretations. You often see what tend to be the kind of conservative responses to kind of these moves in society. But it always tends to move towards the economic and the material in terms of what we're living in and I think what they're doing is they're missing the kind of heart of it. Is there is a certain kind of, under the oppression is a certain kind of spiritual desperation. Mm-hmm. And I think the conservative that moves toward you're living in the best economic times and here's the answer, a good job, has missed the point. And I really think this is kind of an opportunity for the kind of substantive Christian that utilizes its own riches rather than falls in the polarities of right and left, to actually say, wait a minute, what you have on the one hand is a kind of the left, especially a poverty of vision in terms of where they actually sit in terms of opportunities and the capacity to realize them in ways that do not have to tend towards new forms of oppression. But on the other side, the critique needs to be, you know what, you can't just offer our daily, bread alone. You
right.
can't live by bread alone, and having a lot of bread at your table is not the answer.
And there's a kind of irony to this, Tom, isn't there? Because some of the people in the Christian left would say, you're absolutely right, Tom, and that's why we need to get on the justice bandwagon.
Yeah, that's right.
But what they mean by that is we need to make sure that the bread is evenly distributed.
Yeah,
that's it. That's it.
That's right. The bread of life, and I think that's what gets left out of the polarities here. When you can integrate the ability to have bread that can be widespread, but it's oriented properly to the bread of life, you don't have to break into this kind of competition. The Christian vision is always holistic in the sense that it knows how to order these things and order them in ways not to become the extremes. The problem is we like to run with the creaturely, and we end up breaking it apart there. But it is interesting. I mean, in the way these things get framed, you get. I mean, Christianity just sort of gets lumped into either I'm just defending the kind of materialist conservatism, and that therefore makes me guilty of the lack of equal distribution and equity and everything else. When it actually becomes the very point that you have the capacity to redirect that stuff without having to end up in the extremes of destroying everything. And so, I mean, it's an opportunity, but it's one that requires a lot of rigor in terms of a self-conscious kind of Christianity that does not lose sight of the serious teleology about why we're here and what we're up to. Is we can utilize everything the creation has and the moment in time that we are, but we don't have to become part of the polarities that have both detached themselves from the source that kind of orders them the right way. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah. Now, I was going to do a little more with the French Revolution, but this is a good transition point to a different direction. One of the key questions that you have to ask about the late 18th and early 19th century is why the French Revolution didn't happen in England. In other words, why there wasn't a copycat revolution there. Because the fact is, England was in really bad shape in the late 18th century. You talk about decadence. The future George IV, when he was Prince of Wales, seduced 7,000 women and kept a lock of each of their hair.
Wow.
That's how we know how many there were.
That's even better than Wilt Chamberlain.
Yeah. Now, when you're going to be the future king of England, I imagine that's a great line. But, it's still, 25% of unmarried women in London were prostitutes. The average age was 16, and there were brothels that specialized in only girls under 14. There were massive problems with gin. And the reason for that is you're in the middle of something called the enclosure movement, where a lot of people were losing their land. And while you still had the same number of workers in the countryside, you also had a lot of surplus people who end up moving into the cities and start getting stuck in factories that OSHA would shut these things down instantly. They were cold, they were brutal. Your pace was set by the machine, not anything else. Husbands, wives, and children all had to work to make ends meet because they paid dirt wages. Women and children were especially valued because if a machine jammed, they had small hands and could reach in and pull stuff out of the gears. Oh, but if they aren't quick enough, excuse me, your hand gets crushed and you're maimed for life. Oh, and then you lose your job. I mean, this was the conditions in England in this period. It was horrible. And yet there was no revolution there. Nobody, I mean, there are a number of theories why, but I think a good part of it actually predates the late 18th century. I think it goes to the earlier 18th century, in which there was what is technically called the Evangelical Revival in England. The American counterpart is the Great Awakening.
Yeah.
But the Evangelical Revival included Howell Harris and the Welsh Revival. It included the Wesleys in Whitfield. There was a Calvinist component. There was an Arminian component. There were all different components to it. But it hit at a time in England, the only acceptable form of religion was, quote, pro forma religion. I met a guy once who said that the beauty of being he was from England, he said the beauty of being an Anglican is you don't actually have to do anything. And that was more or less the attitude. You get baptized in church, you get married in church, you get buried in the church, get your kids baptized, that's about it. And you go to church on Sunday. Anything more than that, you were a holy roller. You were enthusiastic, was the word they used. But then the revival hits, and it plays primarily among the lower classes. And there is a good suspicion that the revival that had taken place earlier was the thing that provided the buffer that prevented England from degenerating into the chaos of the French Revolution.
It probably had something to do,
They were acting as salt. They were acting as leaven.
Right.
They were doing all of those things.
Yeah, it probably also has something to do with just the sort of the ascendancy of England at that time. I mean, and there's always two ways to sort of look at something. You can look at its downside or its problems or injustices, but then when you do that, you lose sight of the many things that were positive that were going on. And so whenever we have, any kind of view of the past, we really need to have both eyes open. We can't just look at one or the other. And our tendency today is to only keep the eye open that sees the bad. Maybe the problem, 70, 80 years ago was to keep the other eye open that only saw the good. We need to have a binocular vision.
Yeah,
but what I'm getting at is that there were a number of things that came out of that revival that were great, and I think that those. But I think it's kind of gets at what Tom was getting at, though. They weren't promoting revival explicitly to save England from the French Revolution.
Nope. No,
that's right.
Yeah, and by the way, you are right. England is in ascendancy now. England is really the dominant power globally. That may have helped, but it doesn't explain why the lower classes who were really, read Dickens, the lower classes that were really getting whacked in a lot of ways, it doesn't explain why they didn't follow the inspiration of the French.
Well, I guess what I was getting at, though, Glenn, was the idea that because of the harmony within the society, relatively speaking, I mean, there was still tension, there was still conflict, but certainly it wasn't what we saw in France. But because of that, it was the ascendant power. There was a sense in which the virtue that was so evident within the sort of the people who were participating in the revivals in the lower classes, it was so evident they were better workers, they were honest, they were doing things, and they became upwardly mobile. Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of things that were going on that were positive.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that if you actually take a look at it, the Enlightenment theorists out there didn't really, you arguably, with the Napoleonic Code, they created sort of a better society, arguably. But that was after literally hundreds of thousands of French people killed during the Terror alone. In England, you see a better society emerging, largely because of the work of later generations of people from the Evangelical Revival. It's your Wilberforces, it's the Clapham sect, it's all of those people that really spearheaded transformation in England that results in incredible social change, positive things happening, and it's done completely without bloodshed.
Yeah.
A guy named Bebbington, a historian who studied evangelicalism, argues that evangelicalism is built around a handful of concepts. One of them is the centrality of the Bible. One of them is the centrality of Christ. One of them is the centrality of the cross. One of them, though, is the idea that you need to root sin out of wherever it is lodged, which means you need personal repentance and reform, but also because sin embeds itself in society, you need social reform as well. So evangelicals historically in America and in England were the ones who spearheaded social reform. And they accomplished it in England and created a far, far better society without the bloodshed you see in the revolution.
And I mean, there's a lot there too. I mean, on one end, you have evangelicalism and revivalism kind of growing in a certain kind of reaction to certain kind of Enlightenment impacts in the church. And, of course, some of it got read off as enthusiasm, but others, I mean, especially in the U.S., when you have figures like Jonathan Edwards, who's able to combine kind of the riches of Christian tradition with what he would see as kind of true insights from the Enlightenment, you have a very different, and you could argue that he even stopped the spread of certain things within in the U.S. just through some of his own writings. It's been argued, Perry Miller and different figures like that argued. One of the interesting things, though, you get is evangelicals did not take up their social concerns, and they're addressing the sin issues in society merely from what kind of starts today as kind of the social justice notion of kind of the kingdom of God on earth. Theirs was driven very differently. It was a pursuit of the transcendent. And that's the byproduct. The form of life that corresponds to true transcendence is one that is fully immersed in engagement with the earthly. And so immanence and transcendence are fully connected. There isn't a polarity there. And so,
which means that you have to engage in social reform.
You do. You have to. But the engagement with it is the natural byproduct of your pursuing God for God's own sake, rather than pursuing engagement. And so what happens is that gets shifted and severed. With Kant, of course, you break off the transcendent reference and everything becomes this worldly, and then it becomes out of the this worldly resources, and now there's competitions, the power, the worldly powers. And so everything is about asserting who can control the government in order to implement the Christian social vision. And that's very different than what the abolitionists were doing. They're arguing this on the doctrine of the imago Dei of human beings and the full integrity of it. It's the true Christian vision. It's not about top down, kind of politics down, kind of authority, authority.
It's grassroots.
That's right.
And that's the interesting thing about if this theory about the revivals being the thing that prevents England from degenerating into chaos, if that's correct, and I think there's a lot of truth there. I don't think it's the only thing, but I think that there's a lot of truth in that. It points to a couple of different things. One of them is that the kingdom of God does not advance with worldly power.
Yeah.
The kingdom of God does not advance by secular means.
Yeah.
That when you have a revival that is taking place at a grassroots level, when it's hitting real people where they live, even the lower classes, this is going to be the kind of thing that is going to seed society for genuine change, positive change, without requiring violence.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, one of the things that we've suffered from is a tendency to cast aspersions on the dead, libel the dead.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we don't do them justice, and we don't even bother to do our research. I was reading recently here a marvelous piece by Elizabeth Nixon. I don't know if Nickson. I think maybe
Right.
You guys have seen it in C2C Journal. Anyways, she was a leftist. She writes about her years, as the ghostwriter for Nelson Mandela and just different things. I mean, this gal's pedigree when it came to the bona fides and the left was just impeccable, and she's renounced it all. And she renounced it all because she actually went to the trouble of doing some research on her own family. She made a bunch of assumptions about them, and they turned out to be entirely wrong. and she went back and researched, the 400 years of her personal family history, and discovered not only were her ancestors marvelous people and righteous people and on the right side of all sorts of things that she believed in, they were evangelical Christians. That was the thing that was the most difficult pill for her to swallow. She's actually related, through the extended family, to Jonathan Edwards, and she didn't know that. And so now she's essentially said, I was a fool for 20 years. I was completely wrong about my own personal family background and about the past in general. But also, I had bought into an entire program of violence. She talks about the ANC, and when she discovers about this, marvelous, movement that Nelson Mandela led, and how much suffering that movement has brought about in the lives of not white, Afrikaners. We're talking about other Africans, just horrific stuff. And it's the inability of the left to actually deal with any kind of feedback that doesn't sort of reinforce their, as they say, narrative. Yeah. That I think is their their weak spot. I mean, all you have to do is just engage with reality in the present, and then actually look at the past and do it justice. Now, as I noted earlier, you keep both eyes open. You see the bad, but you also see the good. Don't close one of the eyes. Keep them both open. Let's be mature about this. Let's be adults. Yeah. Let's recognize that there's good and bad in the past.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, going back to France, the fact is the Ancien Régime, the old order in France, was hopelessly corrupt. It did need to change. And not all of the ideas of the Enlightenment guys were wrong. The problem was, though, when they got to power, again, I think I said this before, when they got to power and tried to implement their ideas, they realized that the problems were too big to be solved by their theories. And because they really believed it was necessary to throw out the entire past, they couldn't draw on much. They lacked the necessary resources to begin to actually try to solve the problems that were there, because it was all about throwing out everything in the past. And what I see is the danger that we're heading right in that direction now.
But of course, you'll never accuse me of being guilty of unwarranted leaps into wrong directions. But one of the things what you mentioned sparks is this very notion, I think, that when you're talking about the Enlightenment and properly, critically about it, is a lot of people basically assume that, for example, a traditionalist Christian is someone who fully supports the Enlightenment.
That's right.
They don't realize we were the left before there was a left, if you will, without becoming a left that is kind of detached from reality. What we were saying all along is that the kind of synthesis that the Enlightenment wanted to replace the Christian connectedness of things with, after it broke down, after nominalism and different things, we were always saying is illegitimate and perverted both Christian understanding of reality as well as the rest of these things. And so a lot of the problems that developed with the Enlightenment that remain with us today, that we would share a critique of, But our critique is one that says we can actually out-narrate, if you will, rather than have to move into a nihilistic destruction. We have the riches and the capacity to actually take what the Enlightenment stole from Christianity, to place it back within its full reality picture, and then actually set it going for the flourishing of everyone. And I think that's what the abolitionists were up to, and that's what some of these other figures were. Is, you know, we are not people that are here to defend the Enlightenment. We don't need to defend the Enlightenment. Even the things of the Enlightenment that we have benefited from the benefits we get tend to come from the Judeo-Christian aspects that have informed the Enlightenment, not from the parts of the Enlightenment actually undercut those things. And so, I mean, you have, you know, I think Deneen, other figures we've actually engaged before, actually are onto this, you know, their critiques of Locke and freedom, Schindler, or I think it's Schindler. These different figures, we kind of share that. And so one of the things I think that is important, you know, one of our fellow church members, Chris, always talks about what does it look like when we actually step into reality. I think one of the ways of stepping in is to start to articulate the difference of genuine Christianity in terms of its historical shape and form, in terms of its essentials, in contrast both to the Enlightenment and to the kind of left-wing hijacking of it. And I think what Glenn hits on with revivals is what you see is attempts to do that. These are attempts to do it. And when they attempt to do that, they actually have the most important kinds of social change happening when they're trying to basically hold fast to what is distinct about being a Christian in those competing visions that want to kind of absorb them. And they refuse to be absorbed. I mean, you look at figures like Edwards, you look at figures like Wilberforce, and you look at figures like Wesley. I mean, here's somebody who they knew their game in terms of what was going on in their intellectual climate, but they also didn't refuse the historic Christian vision.
Yeah, you brought up Deneen a minute ago. You know, Patrick's a friend of mine. Maybe we should have him on the show sometime, talk about his book, Why Liberalism Failed.
Yeah.
One of these days, I got to actually send some letters out to some people and ask them to be on the show. We've talked about some things. I think we're getting to a point where you need to stop. I think you have a class you need to go to soon, isn't it, Tom?
Yeah, I do. I do. Holy
okay. Well, this has been your show, Glenn, and I know we didn't get to everything you wanted to talk about, but is there anything you want to wrap up with?
Yeah, I guess the thing that really got me thinking about this was actually I did a podcast with Breakpoint on the question of is the situation we're facing now unprecedented? And if not, where are the historical parallels? And it occurred to me that there are certain things about our culture that are unprecedented, but the best parallels that I can think of really is that we have a choice set before us of either, you know, with all of the social unrest we're facing now, we can either go the direction of France or we can go the direction of England. And I will opt every time for England under these circumstances. Now, this assumes this is another whole topic. But this assumes that circumstances outside of the U.S. don't hijack the whole discussion.
Yeah.
And if you're not paying attention to what's going on in the Three Gorges Dam in China, you should be. Let's just kind of note that. But assuming it doesn't collapse by the time this is put up, assuming that things stay stable globally, this is an issue we're going to need to deal with.
Right. Yeah, I think the whole scenario that many of our many younger people didn't ever actually personally have any memory of, the fact that there once upon a time was a rival that could destroy us when we had the Soviet Union in its heyday is returning, and it's a factor that is just beginning, I think, to dawn on some people that we might have assumed it would never dawn on. but anyway, well, we should probably call it a show, just because Tom needs to get to work, and he's got more work to do tonight.
More work to do. Rest the theory.
Well, thanks a lot for listening to the Theology Pugcast, and we really are glad that you do. And maybe next show we'll be back in a pub.
Yes.
We'll let you know. But anyway, thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.